The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the German countryside. It was February 1945, and the war was entering its final, brutal months. Sergeant William Callahan pressed his back against a shattered wall, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. His unit had been pushing through enemy territory for weeks, and exhaustion had become their constant companion. But then, carried on the wind, came a sound that made every man freeze. It wasn't gunfire or artillery. It was crying. Children's voices, desperate and terrified, somewhere out there in the darkness. Will raised his fist, signaling his men to halt. Private Danny Torres looked at him with wide eyes, his rifle lowering slightly. Corporal Frank Pearson tensed, scanning the tree line with suspicion etched across his weathered face. They'd learned to distrust everything in this war. Every sound could be a trap. Every shadow could hide an enemy. But this was different. These were children. The wind howled again, and the cries grew louder. Will's jaw tightened. He'd spent 18 months fighting across Europe, watching friends die, pulling triggers without hesitation. He'd learned to see Germans as the enemy, faceless and uniform in their threat. But children? That changed everything. His own daughter was 8 years old, safe back in Pennsylvania. He carried her photograph in his breast pocket right over his heart. These cries sounded just like hers when she'd fallen from her bicycle the summer before he deployed. Danny stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to check it out, Sarge." Will didn't respond immediately. Protocol dictated caution. They were deep in hostile territory, miles from their main force. Captain Hayes had ordered them to scout the area and return before dawn. Deviating from the mission could get them all killed. But those cries persisted, growing weaker with each passing moment, as if the cold itself was stealing their strength. Frank spoke up, his voice hard. "Could be a trap. The Germans know we're soft when it comes to kids. They could be using them as bait." Will knew Frank had lost his brother at Normandy, shot by a sniper while trying to help wounded soldiers. The man had every reason to be suspicious, every reason to protect what remained of their unit. But Will also knew that some decisions defined who you were beyond the uniform, beyond the war. "Check your weapons," Will ordered quietly. "We move slow, eyes open. If this is a trap, we fight our way out. But we're not leaving children to freeze to death. Not tonight." Danny nodded immediately, relief crossing his young face. Frank hesitated, then chambered around with a metallic click that seemed too loud in the winter silence. The three men moved forward, their boots crunching through snow that reached their knees. The forest was a maze of skeletal trees and deep shadows. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, casting everything in silver and black. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and Will could feel the cold penetrating his layers of clothing, numbing his fingers even inside his gloves. How long had those children been out here? How much time did they have left? The crying grew louder as they pushed deeper into the woods. Then Danny spotted it, a collapsed building, half buried in snow. It might have been a schoolhouse once, or maybe a small church. The roof had caved in on one side, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel damage. The cries were coming from inside. Will signaled his men to take positions. He approached the entrance, his rifle raised, every sense on high alert. The door hung off its hinges, revealing darkness within. Will pulled out his flashlight, knowing the risk of giving away their position, but there was no other choice. The beam cut through the blackness, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Children, dozens of them, huddled together in the corner of what remained of the building's interior. Their faces were pale, their lips blue with cold. They wore thin coats and inadequate shoes, completely unprepared for the brutal winter conditions. Some were crying, others had gone silent, too weak to make a sound. Their eyes reflected his flashlight like frightened animals. "Jesus Christ," Danny breathed beside him, lowering his rifle immediately. "They're just kids." Will stepped inside, his combat instincts warring with his humanity. He counted quickly. 18 children, ranging from what looked like 4 years old to early teens. A girl, maybe 12, stood in front of the others protectively. Her blonde hair was matted with snow, and her thin dress was torn. She stared at Will with a mixture of terror and defiance, her arms spread wide as if her small body could shield the children behind her from whatever these American soldiers might do. "We're not going to hurt you," Will said, though he knew his words meant nothing to her. The language barrier was absolute. He slowly lowered his rifle, holding up one hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The girl didn't move, but her eyes tracked his every motion. Behind her, a small boy began coughing, a wet, rattling sound that Will recognized immediately. Pneumonia, or close to it. Without treatment, without warmth. That kid had hours at best. Frank moved up beside him, his expression unreadable. "We can't take them with us, Sarge. We're 3 men, 10 miles from our lines, in enemy territory. We'd never make it." Will knew Frank was right from a tactical standpoint, but tactics felt meaningless standing in front of 18 freezing children. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "We leave them here to die?" Frank's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. Danny had already moved past them, kneeling beside the children. He pulled off his coat, wrapping it around the shoulders of a small girl who couldn't have been more than 5. She flinched at his touch, but she was too cold to resist. Danny smiled at her, that same gentle smile that made him everyone's favorite back at camp. The kid from Texas who'd never lost his optimism despite everything this war had thrown at them. "It's okay, little one," Danny said softly. "We've got you now." The older German girl, the one acting as protector, spoke suddenly. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from cold and crying. "Bitte helfen Sie uns. Sie sterben. Please help us. They're dying." Will didn't speak German fluently, but he'd picked up enough during the campaign to understand. She switched to broken English, her words tumbling out desperately. "Orphanage. We from orphanage. Bombs came. Frau Weber, she tried to take us away, but we lost. So cold, so hungry. Please." Will felt something crack inside his chest, the armor he'd built over months of combat suddenly feeling paper thin. He thought of his daughter again, imagined her lost and freezing, crying for help that might never come. He made his decision in that instant. Consequences be damned. "Frank, get on the radio. Contact Captain Hayes. Tell him we've found civilians in critical condition and we're bringing them in. Danny, inventory what supplies we have. Food, blankets, anything that can help." Frank's eyes widened. "Will, this is insane. We don't have the resources. We don't have the manpower." Will turned to face him fully, his voice dropping to a command tone that left no room for argument. "I gave you an order, Corporal." Frank stared at him for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then, slowly, he nodded and moved to the radio. Danny was already distributing what little food they had in their packs. The children grabbed at the rations with desperate hands, too hungry to care what they were eating. Will watched the small boy, the one who'd been coughing, struggling to chew a piece of hardtack. The kid's eyes were glassy with fever, his breathing labored. Will moved to him, feeling his forehead, burning up despite the cold. "This one's in bad shape," he called to Danny. "We need to warm him up fast." The German girl knelt beside Will. Her name was Liesel, she explained haltingly. The sick boy was Klaus, her neighbor from before the war, before everything fell apart. She'd been trying to keep them all alive since they got separated from their caretaker 3 days ago. 3 days. Will couldn't imagine it. 3 days in this cold, with no food, no shelter worth the name, watching the smaller children slowly succumb to hypothermia. "You're brave," Will told her, meeting her eyes. "You did everything you could." Liesel's composure cracked slightly, tears forming. I tried so hard, but they so cold. I think maybe we die here." Will shook his head firmly. "Nobody's dying. Not tonight. Not if I have anything to say about it." Frank returned, his expression grim. "Captain's on the line. He wants to talk to you." Will took the radio handset, stepping away slightly. Captain Hayes's voice crackled through, barely audible over the static. "Callahan, report. What's this about civilians?" Will explained the situation as concisely as possible. 18 orphaned children, critical condition, requesting immediate extraction or support. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then Hayes spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions. "Sergeant, you know I can't authorize an extraction. We don't have the resources. We're barely holding our position as is. Those children are technically enemy nationals." Will felt anger surge through him. "With respect, sir, they're children. The enemy is armed soldiers, not orphans freezing to death." Another pause. "Watch your tone, Sergeant." Hayes's voice softened slightly. "Look, I understand the situation. I have kids too. But we're in the middle of a war. I can't risk men and resources for this. You're ordered to continue your original mission." Mark the location and we'll try to send someone after we've secured the area. That could be days, weeks even. Will looked back at the children, at Klaus struggling to breathe, at the smaller ones who'd stopped crying simply because they didn't have the energy anymore. Days or weeks meant corpses, not rescues. Will made a decision that could end his military career or worse. Sir, with respect, I'm refusing that order. We're bringing these children in. Hayes's voice exploded through the radio. Sergeant, you do not have the authority to refuse orders. Will spoke calmly, though his heart was racing. Then court-martial me when this is over, sir. But right now, I've got 18 children who will be dead by morning if we don't act. I'm not leaving them. The radio went silent. Will waited, wondering if he'd just destroyed everything. Then Hayes came back on, his voice resigned. God help me, Callahan. You always were stubborn. All right. You want to do this? You do it on your own initiative. I can't order men to support you, but I won't order them to stop you either. Get those kids to safety if you can, but if this goes sideways, it's on you. Understood? Understood, sir. Thank you. Will handed the radio back to Frank, who'd been listening with wide eyes. You just tanked your career for these kids, Frank said quietly. Will shrugged. Then it was worth it. Something changed in Frank's expression then. The hardness softened, replaced by something that might have been respect, or maybe just recognition of a kindred spirit. All right, Sarge. How do we do this? Danny grinned, relief evident on his face. That's what I'm talking about. Let's save some lives. They spent the next hour preparing. Will used his knife to cut blankets into strips, wrapping the children's hands and feet for extra insulation. Danny fashioned crude sleds from broken wood and their ponchos, creating ways to pull the smallest children who couldn't walk the distance. Frank worked with Liesel to organize the children by capability, figuring out who could walk and who needed to be carried. It was logistics born of desperation, but it was something. The older children, Liesel and 3 others around her age, could walk with assistance. 8 more could manage if they moved slowly and had support. But 7, including Klaus, were too weak or too young. Those would need to be carried or pulled on the makeshift sleds. 3 men, 18 children, 10 miles through enemy territory in sub-zero temperatures. The odds were impossible, but Will had faced impossible odds before. They moved out as quietly as possible. Will took point, his rifle ready despite having his arms full carrying one of the smallest children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4. She'd wrapped her tiny arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. He could feel her shivering violently. Danny followed, pulling one of the sleds with 2 children on it, while also supporting a boy who could barely walk. Frank brought up the rear, carrying Klaus in his arms and constantly scanning behind them for threats. Liesel walked beside Will, helping to shepherd the ambulatory children. She'd proven to be remarkably capable, translating Will's instructions to the others and keeping them moving when they wanted to stop. Every few hundred yards they had to pause to rest, but Will knew every stop cost them precious time and body heat. The temperature was still dropping, and dawn was hours away. They'd been moving for maybe 20 minutes when they heard it. Voices in the distance, speaking German. Enemy patrol. Will signaled everyone to freeze. The children, to their credit, went completely silent. Even the smallest seemed to understand the danger. Will's mind raced. They were in the open, on a forest path, completely exposed. If the patrol came this way, there would be no hiding 18 children. The voices grew closer. Will could see flashlight beams cutting through the trees ahead. He made a quick decision, gesturing frantically to move everyone off the path and into deeper snow. They scrambled as quietly as possible, the children struggling through drifts that reached their waists. Will found a cluster of fallen trees and heavy brush, pushing the children into the natural shelter and covering them as best he could with branches and snow. Everyone stay absolutely still, he whispered to Liesel, who translated in urgent, hushed tones. The children huddled together, eyes wide with fear. Danny and Frank took position on either side, rifles ready. Will crouched at the front, every muscle tensed. The German patrol came into view on the path, 4 soldiers heavily armed, moving with the casual alertness of men on routine duty. They were less than 30 feet away. One of the German soldiers stopped, looking directly toward their hiding spot. Will's finger moved to his trigger. If this went bad, they'd have to fight, and fighting would doom the children. The soldier said something to his companions, gesturing toward the brush. Will's heart hammered. Then one of the children behind him, a small boy, began to cough. Not loud, but in the frozen silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. The German soldier's head snapped toward the sound. He called out, asking if someone was there. Will prepared to open fire, knowing it would likely be the last thing he did. But then Frank did something unexpected. He cupped his hands around his mouth and made a sound, a perfect imitation of a fox's bark. The German soldiers laughed, one of them saying something about animals. They moved on, their voices and footsteps fading into the night. Will let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Frank caught his eye and gave a small nod. The man had just saved all their lives with a trick he'd probably learned hunting back home. Sometimes the smallest skills made the biggest difference. They waited another 5 minutes to be sure the patrol was gone, then carefully extracted themselves from their hiding spot. The children were in worse shape now. The extra time in the deep snow had leached what little warmth they had left. Klaus's breathing had become even more labored, and 2 of the smaller children had stopped shivering, which Will knew was a very bad sign. When someone stopped shivering in the cold, it meant their body was shutting down. They needed to move faster, but faster meant more noise, more risk of detection. Danny voiced what they were all thinking. "We're not gonna make it at this pace, Sarge." Will knew he was right. They'd covered maybe a mile with 9 more to go. At this rate, they'd lose half the children before reaching friendly lines. He needed a new plan, but the options were limited. Then Liesel spoke up, pointing to the east. She knew of a farm, she said, abandoned since the fighting came through. It was closer, maybe 2 miles. They could rest there, warm up, then continue. It was a risk. The farm could be occupied, by civilians, by enemy soldiers, by anyone, but it was also their best chance. Change of plans, Will decided. We head for the farm. 2 miles, people. We can do 2 miles. He tried to sound confident, to project the certainty that leaders were supposed to show. Inside, he was terrified. Terrified of making the wrong call, of leading these children to something worse than freezing. But doing nothing guaranteed death, so they moved. The 2 miles felt like 20. Every step was a struggle. Will took turns with Danny and Frank carrying different children, trying to distribute the physical burden. His arms burned, his legs ached, and his lungs felt like ice with each breath. But whenever he wanted to stop, he'd look down at the small face pressed against his chest and find the strength to take another step. These children had survived bombs, displacement, hunger, and cold. The least he could do was survive carrying them. The farm appeared like a ghost out of the swirling snow. It was larger than Will had hoped. A main house and 2 outbuildings surrounded by bare fields. No lights, no smoke from the chimney, no signs of occupation, but also no guarantee it was empty. Frank, Danny, and Will exchanged glances. They needed to clear the buildings before bringing the children in. "Liesel, keep everyone here," Will instructed. "Stay low, stay quiet. We'll be right back." The 3 soldiers approached the farmhouse with weapons raised, using hand signals developed through months of combat. Danny went left, Frank right, Will up the middle to the front door. It was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. Not a good sign. Will pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of hinges. The interior was dark and cold, but there was no immediate threat. He clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the rooms. The place had been abandoned in a hurry. Furniture overturned, belongings scattered, signs of a hasty evacuation. But it was structurally sound, and more importantly, there was a fireplace. Danny found the kitchen and let out a small whoop of victory. "Canned goods, Sarge. Whoever lived here left in such a hurry they left food." Frank had been checking the bedrooms and returned with an armload of blankets. "We're in luck. This place is stocked." Will allowed himself a moment of relief. Maybe God or fate or simple chance was on their side tonight. They brought the children in quickly, getting them out of the cold and onto the floor in front of the fireplace. Frank started a fire using wood from a pile beside the hearth. The flames caught quickly, spreading warmth and light through the room. The children gravitated toward it like moths, holding their hands out to the heat. Some began crying again. Tears of relief this time. Danny heated soup from the canned goods, distributing it in whatever containers he could find. Will focused on Klaus. The boy's condition had deteriorated significantly. His fever was raging, and his breathing had become shallow. Will stripped off the wet clothing and wrapped him in dry blankets, trying to warm him gradually. Too fast could be as dangerous as not enough. He'd seen cases of exposure before. knew that warming someone too quickly could send them into shock. Klaus's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. He mumbled something in German, maybe calling for his mother. Liesel knelt beside them, taking Klaus's hand. She spoke to him softly, words Will couldn't understand but whose meaning was universal. Comfort, reassurance, the promise that he wasn't alone. Klaus seemed to calm slightly at her voice. Will looked at this 12-year-old girl who'd kept 18 children alive for 3 days through sheer force of will. She had more courage than most soldiers he'd served with. As the children ate and slowly warmed up, Will took stock of their situation. They'd bought time, but they weren't safe. This farm was still in contested territory. Come morning, patrols would be out in force. They needed to rest, but not for long. A few hours at most, then they'd have to push on to friendly lines. He looked at his men. Danny was helping a little girl eat soup, making silly faces to get her to smile. Frank sat with his back against the wall, Klaus still in his arms, staring into the fire with an expression Will had never seen on him before. Something had shifted in the hard-edged corporal. Frank caught Will looking and spoke quietly. "My brother, the one I lost. He was trying to help some French kids when he got shot. I always thought he was foolish letting his guard down like that." Will waited, sensing Frank needed to say this. But maybe he wasn't foolish. Maybe he just understood something I didn't, that some things matter more than tactics or survival. Frank looked down at Klaus. "This kid reminds me of my nephew. Same age, same dark hair. I keep thinking, what if this was him? What if my nephew was lost and freezing and some enemy soldier found him? I'd want that soldier to help, wouldn't I? Even if we were at war. Even if it made no sense." Will nodded slowly. "We're all somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's father. The uniforms make us forget that sometimes." Frank smiled grimly. Yeah, they do." The two men sat in companionable silence, watching the children slowly recover. It was a small miracle, this moment of peace in the middle of chaos. Will knew it couldn't last, but he was grateful for it nonetheless. They rested for 3 hours. Will stayed awake, keeping watch, letting Danny and Frank sleep in shifts. He used the time to check each child, making sure they were warming properly, that no one was developing frostbite or showing signs of hypothermia complications. Most of them had fallen asleep, exhausted bodies finally able to rest. Klaus's fever had broken slightly, though he was still far from healthy. It was progress, tiny but crucial. As dawn approached, Will knew they had to move. He woke his men gently, and together they prepared the children. They'd found better clothing in the farmhouse, warmer coats and proper boots that mostly fit. They loaded up on the canned food, stuffing packs and pockets. The children were in better shape now, having rested and eaten. Even the smallest seemed to have found new reserves of energy. Liesel helped organize them again, her efficiency remarkable. The final stretch was 7 miles. 7 miles to friendly lines and safety. Will laid out the route using a map he'd found in the farmhouse, explaining it to his men and to Liesel. They'd follow the main road for part of the way, riskier but faster, then cut through fields for the final approach. If they kept a good pace, they could make it by noon. If they weren't intercepted, they moved out into the gray pre-dawn light. The snow had stopped, which was a blessing. Visibility improved, making navigation easier, but also making them more exposed. Will set a steady pace, not too fast to exhaust the children, not so slow that they'd be caught in the open when full daylight came. The children walked in a rough column, the older ones helping the younger. Danny and Frank interspersed to provide support. They looked like refugees from every war in history, a ragged line of survivors moving toward hope. The first hour passed without incident. They made good progress, covering almost 2 miles. The children's spirits had lifted with the food and rest. Some even talked quietly among themselves, and once Will heard a small laugh from one of the younger girls. It was a beautiful sound, innocent and pure, completely incongruous with their surroundings. It reminded him why they were doing this, why it mattered. The second hour brought challenges. One of the makeshift sleds broke, forcing them to redistribute the children. A little boy twisted his ankle, requiring Frank to carry him. They had to detour around a destroyed bridge, adding precious time. But they pushed on, Will constantly checking their position, calculating distances, timing. His military training served him well here, turning a desperate rescue into a tactical operation. He fell back on procedure when emotion threatened to overwhelm. By mid-morning, they could hear artillery in the distance. The front line, shifting and deadly. They were getting close to friendly forces, but that meant they were also getting close to active combat. Will felt tension ratchet up. They'd come so far, lost no one, against all odds. The thought of losing someone now, so close to safety, was unbearable. He pushed them faster, sensing they were running out of time and luck. Then they crested a hill and saw it. American positions, foxholes, and defensive works, recognizable even from a distance. "We're almost there," Will called back. "Just a little further." The children perked up, sensing the change in mood. Even those who didn't understand English could feel that something significant was ahead. Liesel looked at Will with hope in her eyes for the first time since they'd met. "Are we safe now?" "Almost," Will promised. "Very soon." They started down the hill toward the American lines. Will was already thinking about how to approach without getting shot. Friendly fire was a real danger, especially coming from the German side of the line. He'd need to identify himself clearly, make sure his men didn't do anything that could be interpreted as hostile. He was mentally rehearsing the approach when he heard the sound that stopped his heart. A vehicle engine, coming up fast behind them. "Everyone down!" Will shouted, pushing children toward a drainage ditch beside the road. His men reacted instantly, weapons coming up. A German half-track crested the hill behind them, moving at speed. It screeched to a halt when the soldiers inside spotted them. For a frozen second, nobody moved. American soldiers and German soldiers stared at each other over 50 yards of snowy road, with 18 children caught in between. The German commander, an officer Will could see through the vehicle's windshield, stepped out slowly. He was older, maybe 40, with the bearing of a career soldier. He surveyed the scene, taking in the American uniforms, the huddled children, the desperate circumstances. His hand rested on his sidearm, but he didn't draw. He said something in German, his voice carrying across the distance. Liesel translated, her voice shaking. He asks, "What is happening here?" He asks why American soldiers have German children. Will stepped forward slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. He spoke carefully, using what German he knew, and hoping Liesel would fill in the gaps. "These children orphans. We find them freezing. We bring them to safety." He gestured toward the American lines below. "No fight. Just help children." The German officer's eyes narrowed. He looked at Will, at the children, at the situation. His men in the half-track had their weapons trained on the Americans, fingers on triggers. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and this ended in blood. The officer spoke again, longer this time. Liesel translated, tears now streaming down her face. He says he knows these children. They from orphanage in his district. He says he has been looking for them. He thought they were dead. Will's mind raced. This could go either way. The officer could try to take the children, could see the Americans as kidnapping them, or he could see the truth. There was a long, agonizing pause. Then the German officer did something Will never expected. He saluted. A crisp, formal military salute, one soldier to another. The officer spoke one more time, his voice thick with emotion. Liesel translated, barely able to get the words out. He says thank you. He says you are good men. He says he will not stop you. Will returned the salute, a lump in his throat. The German officer climbed back into his half-track. He said something to his men, and the vehicle turned around, heading back the way it came. Will watched it disappear over the hill, hardly believing what had just happened. Even in war, even between enemies, humanity could still emerge. They covered the final mile quickly. American sentries spotted them coming and called out challenges. Will identified himself, explained the situation in rapid-fire sentences. Within minutes, they were surrounded by American soldiers, medics rushing forward to examine the children. Captain Hayes appeared, looking at Will with an expression that mixed exasperation, relief, and something that might have been pride. "You insane son of a bitch," he said. But he was smiling. "You actually did it." The children were taken to the medical tent, given blankets, food, proper care. Klaus was rushed to see a doctor, his condition serious but treatable now. Will, Danny, and Frank stood aside, watching the controlled chaos of the rescue's conclusion. They'd walked over 10 miles through enemy territory in sub-zero temperatures, evaded patrols, survived encounters that should have ended in firefights, and delivered 18 children to safety. Against all odds, Against all logic, they'd done it. Liesel found Will before she was taken to the medical tent. She looked up at him with those solemn eyes that had seen too much for her age. She spoke in halting English. "Thank you. You save us. All of us. I never forget." Will knelt down to her level. "You saved them first, Liesel. You kept them alive until we could help. You're the real hero here." She shook her head. "We are all heroes, I think. Sometimes good people do good things, even in bad times." Then she hugged him, fiercely, and was led away by a nurse. The aftermath was complicated. There were reports to file, explanations to give, questions about Will's refusal of orders. Captain Hayes went to bat for him, arguing that Will had shown initiative and moral courage. The children's survival became a human interest story, reported in newspapers back home. Will, Danny, and Frank were commended. Though Will always felt uncomfortable with the recognition, they'd just done what anyone with a conscience would have done. At least, that's what he told himself. The war ended 3 months later. Will went home to Pennsylvania to his daughter, who'd grown taller in his absence. He didn't talk much about what he'd seen, what he'd done, but he kept in touch with Danny and Frank, and when Liesel wrote to him years later, fluent in English now and studying to be a teacher, he wrote back. She told him that all 18 children had survived, that Klaus had recovered fully, that they'd been reunited with family or found new homes. She thanked him again, and told him something he'd never forget. She wrote that in the darkest moment of her life, when she'd been certain they would all die in that frozen ruin. She'd heard American voices and thought they were saved. But then she'd remembered they were the enemy, and she'd been terrified. It was only when she saw Will's eyes, when she saw him look at the children with tenderness instead of hate, that she understood something important. She understood that soldiers were people first, and that wars were fought by governments but humanity survived in individuals. She wrote that the night he found them had taught her more about goodness than any lesson in any classroom ever could. Will kept that letter for the rest of his life. He'd read it when he doubted himself, when he wondered if his choices had mattered. Because that night in the snow, that desperate march through enemy territory, that moment when a German officer saluted and let them pass, all of it proved something essential. It proved that even in war, even in the depths of hatred and violence, compassion could still exist. It proved that seeing the humanity in your enemy didn't make you weak. It made you more fully human. And it proved that sometimes the most important battles weren't won with bullets, but with the simple decision to help someone in need. The story spread quietly over the years. Veterans would share it at reunions. Parents would tell their children. Historians would note it as a footnote to the greater narrative of the war. But for Will, Danny, Frank, and the 18 children they saved, it was never a footnote. It was the night that defined them. The night they chose mercy over mission, humanity over protocol. It was the night they heard cries in the snow and decided that some orders were worth refusing, some risks were worth taking, and some lives were worth everything. And in a war that had seen so much darkness, it was a small light. A reminder that even in the coldest winter, even in the midst of death, warmth and life could still survive. All it took was someone willing to listen, someone willing to help, someone willing to carry a freezing child through the night toward safety.